We have joining us Simon Orr, who is the Net Zero Plan Lead at National Grid, Ita Kettleborough, who's the Deputy Director of Energy Transitions Commission, and Dr. Laura Schade, who's an Energy Engineer, Senior Executive Officer at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. I will give everyone a chance to introduce themselves in more detail, and then we will go on to the general topic of the panel. The way the panel is going to work is whoever wants to speak, if you could just raise your hand, then we don't all talk over each other. Perfect. Shall we start with you, Simon?
Great, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, perfect, thank you.
Wonderful. So my name's Simon Orr, as John already introduced me. So I'm essentially responsible for National Grid electricity transmission. So that's the bit of National Grid that owns and operates the actual sort of network assets at high voltage in England and Wales. So I'm responsible for our sort of long-term strategy and engineering thinking about how we get to net zero in 2050 and how we help the whole country get to net zero by 2050. And I've been sort of really thinking about this and working on this for about 5 years now. Wrestling with a lot of these questions and starting to plan out what we need to do as a business to get there and help us all get there, essentially, because the transmission system's kind of really important for pretty much every part of our economy to decarbonize.
Perfect. Thank you. Ita, shall we next introduce you?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. My name is Ita Kettleborough. I'm the Director of the Energy Transitions Commission. We are a coalition of high ambition leaders from across the energy space. So we're deliberately cross-sectoral and cross-regional. We have members from the kind of old and new energy worlds. We have members from the harder to abate sectors or the energy intensive sectors that need to be consuming decarbonised energy to deliver the energy transition, the finance sector, and also civil society and academia. And to get in working together as a commission since just after the Paris Agreement to bring together this high ambition voice for what it will take to deliver a net zero economy by mid-century. So we know that the climate science tells us that that's where we need to be. That's what the constraints we face as a world in order to limit kind of catastrophic global climate change. So what does that look like, and what can that look like, and is it feasible? That was kind of the first question we were asking ourselves. And what would the shape of that system be? So really here we are very, very aligned with a lot of Matthew's great, very clear presentation he just went through. There is no silver bullet, but it's useful to have a shape of the vision given the pace and scale of change that we know we need to deliver in the next 3 decades. So kind of we roughly say, rich, developed economies aiming for net zero by 2050 and decarbonisation by 2050, with lower income countries trying to aim for around 2060 or just after. So kind of that's the shape of what we've set ourselves. What will that look like? And then what's required to get there in terms of the actions from policymakers, but also from corporates, from investors, from civil society. What are those things that we need to be doing now in the 2020s to ensure we're on that net zero trajectory, and indeed that trajectory is going fast enough, because of course it's not just the end state, it's also the speed we get there to limit the kind of cumulative emissions that are in the atmosphere.
Perfect. Thank you. And finally, Dr. Laura Schade. I believe I'm pronouncing your name right. I might not be, but I'll let you introduce yourself.
That's fine, Jordan. Thank you very much for organizing this and for inviting me. Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfectly. Okay, thank you.
Great. Yes. So I'm Laura Schade. My surname is actually German, even though I come from Italy. So don't worry about the confusion. Everybody gets it wrong. So I'm a technical energy specialist for the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, also known as BEIS. And one of the main priorities of this department is actually to tackle climate change. I have a background in physics, and a PhD in condensed matter physics, where I worked on perovskite materials for photovoltaics application. And here in BEIS, my role is to give technical advice to the policy teams in the area of smart energy, specifically flexibility and domestic demand side response, but also supporting the innovation programs to drive the innovation to net zero forward. And I'm really happy to be here and answer your questions.
Perfect. Thank you. So we are going to have questions both from the audience and from myself. So if anyone in the audience does want to write a question in the Q&A for our panel, feel free. But I want to start off with the big question of this panel, and that's, is the UK government's goal of net zero feasible by 2050? And what needs to be done to ensure that we meet that target? Who wants to go first? Perfect. Aita.
So perhaps, I guess, unsurprisingly, given my introduction, I think what we would say from a kind of global perspective, so even beyond the UK, we really believe net zero by mid-century is technically and economically feasible. So that is, that's the big message. Really crucially, that means it's feasible with technologies that we have today. That's not to say there won't be innovations, and indeed we hope there will be innovations that make it easier and cheaper, things we haven't foreseen, but that doesn't mean that we don't already have the toolbox available that would allow us to do that. And I think that the key thing here is really to recognize that profound transformation of the energy system that Matthew really helpfully walked us through just before, in terms of recognizing that that's part of a wider trend. So we're transforming again, but we've transformed before. We need to use less energy, as we've talked about. We need to drive massive clean electrification at the core of net zero. So that's going to enable a lot of things. We think globally, we're talking about increasing electricity as a share of final energy demand from 20%-ish today to 60 to 70% by mid-century. And so that's a huge build out of the power system. And a simultaneously decarbonisation, so kind of looking at 3.5 to 5 times the amount of electricity use. But also, and we think that's possible because of the rapidly falling costs of renewables, and the fact that we have, and we can think at an all-in system cost, we can balance that with the storage and flexibility to meet those needs. And hopefully we can come back and talk to that a lot more in terms of what does that really mean. But also in those other areas which have traditionally been seen as very difficult to decarbonise, we know there are alternatives that we can use. We can use clean hydrogen in a lot of cases, and we can complement that clean hydrogen with really vital but ultimately constrained roles for both sustainable biomass, where there's a real issue around the food and land use system that we need to be aware of. We can't just assume we can take all the land not to grow food or for biodiversity, but instead for energy crops. So that's a challenge. And also CCUS alongside that critical reality for carbon dioxide removals, because unfortunately, as fast as we want to go, we think we probably won't be able to go quite fast enough, as very much echoing the climate scientist Sir David King's warning that we're approaching faster. And just finally, just 3 quick points in terms of what do we actually need to do that. Three key priorities, really, and some of which I think the UK government is doing already, which is great, but there are still certainly big areas to go after. The first is speeding up the deployment of the proven solutions. So renewable power, EV, where we know we can use those, wind and solar build out. We need to be driving that faster, far faster than we're doing it at the moment. And that's a kind of no regret. We need to create the right policy and investment environment to bring forward the next generation of decarbonisation technologies, where we do see green premiums versus the BAU today. So that's, removing fossil fuel subsidies, it's carbon prices, it's tightening standards and regulations. And finally, there are a kind of suite of technologies that will be critical especially in the harder to abate sectors, but which are they're proven, they work, but they're at very low scale at the moment, and we need to very rapidly commercialize those technologies. SAFs is a good example, sustainable aviation fuels, hydrogen direct reduction, another good example, and they need to be supported both by industry, which stepping into those projects, but also crucially by policymakers.
Simon. Simon, you're still muted. Sorry.
Sorry. I would echo a lot of what Ita has already said. I think that it's definitely technically, economically feasible. I think the kind of the big feasibility kind of question is more around sort of the societal, political kind of level, and making sure that we get this kind of collective effort kind of on that level, and we stay aligned and we stay focused, because a lot of this stuff is about long run scaling things up, long run progress. We can't afford to kind of wobble and sort of move away in one direction and slow down and speed up. We kind of need to put the pedal down now and just continue to accelerate to 2050. So that's, I think, a really core kind of feasibility question. Can we keep the society's kind of goal? And I think we need to not just maintain the kind of level of consensus that we have now in societal awareness. I think we need to increase that. I still have kind of non-energy industry friends and people approach me and they say, oh, do you really think electric cars are the future? And it's like, 5 years ago, we decided 5 years ago that it was electric cars. The debate ended 5 years ago. There's no more debate. Like, it's law, like it's happening. So I think there's not quite the kind of awareness about even the things that I'm calling like the no-brainer, we just need to do it stuff. Society-wise, there's not that kind of awareness of like, that's already done. We're moved on to the next question of what we're going to do to get to net zero. So I think that's really the area, that would be the area that I'd be concerned about in terms of feasibility. But yeah, technologically, economically, there's optimization to do, there's scaling, but I don't think there's doubt that it's achievable.
We did have Dr. Laura's hand up. Are you still there? I think we've lost her just for a second.
Yes.
There we go.
I'm having some connection problem. Can you hear me? I believe you can't see me.
I can hear you.
I just doing. Okay, I'll try to put my video on, but in the meanwhile, I'll start talking since you can hear me.
No worries.
So definitely, I agree with what Simon and Ita said now, that achieving net zero is definitely feasible, and it does need to happen, but it also needs consistent effort and planning to be achieved by 2050. And also, as mentioned, it also needs the right policy and investment framework. Sorry, I'll just try to quickly put my camera on now. It looks like it's working a bit better. Can you still hear me?
Yes, still hear you.
Okay, great. So the transition to net zero means that the energy system will become definitely more decentralized and diverse, and data sharing also will be really important to coordinate all of the parties that will get new roles across the sector, and also to ensure system stability. And I believe from the electricity system point of view, we have broadly two main changes. One is on the supply side, and where there is an increasing need for renewable power from distributed generation, such as wind and solar, rather than large fossil fuel generators, and also the need to manage energy storage. And on the demand side, the electrification of heat and transport will increase and also will change the profile of demand. And so this means that the net zero transition requires new flexible technologies on the demand side of the electricity system that were not required with fossil fuel generation. And this flexibility can be provided in several ways. So, for example, with demand-side response, so allowing system operators to control the operation of types of appliances within bounds set by the consumers, or interconnection, for example, to interconnecting many networks together in a grid to produce bigger networks, and also through electrical storage system. And increased flexibility provided, for example, through DSR, storage and interconnection could reduce also the decarbonized electricity system cost by a max of 12 billions per year by 2050. So it is important to move quickly, and it will be really difficult to achieve the decarbonization of the sector without higher level of system flexibility. And this is something that it's really important for the future to maintain energy security and also to cost effectively integrate also all of the renewable generation. And another point that I wanted to make, which is important, is that as we move from a small number of large generation sites to large number of small generation sites, the majority of which are at the extremities of at the edge of the network, so they are connected to the distribution system, and also will be intermittent in their supply. It is really important to balance dynamically to ensure stable supply, and the data rate is going to increase. So we also need suitable radio communication solutions. And this means understanding and analyzes the radio communication technologies that we have now, and understanding if there are some risks that this technology will not be able to meet the requirements of the transitions. And where risks are found, we need to understand what our options are and ensure that that digitalization is supported with suitable radio connectivity. I'm going to try and start my video again now that I just stopped talking, and I hope it will work. Apologies for this.
No worries. The one thing that I noted that you all said was that we have the technology available, but last year, US climate envoy John Kerry argued that we don't yet have the technologies available for net zero by 2045. But what does that mean, and what technologies will need to be further developed? Simon?
So I think it's important to recognize that different parts of the world have different energy resources. And there are some countries that actually already have, completely net zero energy supplies. I think Costa Rica with hydro, Norway, but Oklahoma doesn't have a lot of fjords. Doesn't have the Amazon, rainforest kind of. Basically, every country is different. And there are some countries, in the UK, we're very blessed with having this enormous offshore wind resource and onshore wind resource as well. We get a bit of sun, but we get a lot of wind, and we get a lot of wind, especially offshore. So I think the technological balance, and also how the amount of energy that different countries use, just the average household, is hugely variant. So I think that's an important thing to put into context. When John Kerry's primarily talking about America. So I think that's one point. And I think the other thing is there's a lot of technologies that need to be scaled. There's a lot of technologies that need to be kind of optimized. There's a lot of technologies that need to be fitted together that currently kind of work in isolation. And we need to work out how not only do we scale them up, but how do we make them work well together? How do we optimize our storage solutions? How do we optimize with generation, with demand? How do we optimize different types of storage solutions together? All of these sort of things. But I think there's definitely a pathway where we can scale the things that we can do already and scale up the things that we're starting to do at a small scale. I don't think there's a need for a technology that doesn't even exist in the lab or only exists in the lab for us to be able to reach net zero. But there's certainly innovation and optimization that can be done.
I've absolutely agreed with all of that. I think I would also add to that when you think about the transformation that we need at the system level, you also recognize that when you consider different parts of the solution based on today's...
I think we might have lost Ita. Okay. We'll try and get out.
One thing we know is...
Ita, we lost you for a second there.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's
okay.
Please continue.
Sorry, so I was just basically saying I very much agreed. The other thing around, so I very much feel that the technologies are available, but there are a number of very key technologies that need to be commercialized. On the optimization point, the other part of the optimization point is to think about the system transformation. So there are parts of the system that can feel very insurmountable if you're only looking at that silo. So one of the key things that this actually boils down to is, can we scale the supply of clean electricity fast enough to meet the needs for some of these other enabling technologies? And that would include, for instance, clean hydrogen, where it's produced via electrolysis using clean power. That's quite an inefficient way of creating an energy vector. We do it because of its different characteristics versus direct electrification. So we can use it in different use cases, especially around transportation, where we need a more energy dense fuel. But to produce that clean hydrogen alongside the direct electrification, and indeed alongside direct air capture, if we really believe we need that, it's quite an energy intensive process to take a very, very small amount of carbon dioxide from the air and extract it and put it underground. We believe, so when you look at those on their own, the limitation of being able to scale clean power can feel overwhelming. This is it. We can't do this. If you look at a system level and you say, why could we not scale clean power? Do we have enough renewable resources? Do we have enough materials? Can we think about supply chain collaborations? Can we work together across value chains? The answer to all of those questions, we would say, is yes. We do have them, but it won't be straightforward, and we have to recognize the scale of the challenge, and that point that Laura mentioned around coordination and planning and having a vision of where we're going becomes all the more important.
The one thing we have all spoken about in terms of net zero is that a lot of these technologies are going to be basically electrically powered, like electric vehicles. So there's going to be a lot of electrification. And this is probably something you can talk quite at length about, Simon. What does that mean for the grid? Because obviously there's going to be an increase in demand for electric. So what technologies are we going to have to install on the grid to ensure we can deal with that increase in demand as we electrify everything, heat, vehicles, everything?
So if we're just thinking about the grid itself, I think there's definitely three kind of transformations that we're going to need to go through for the grid to be able to meet the kind of scale and the nature of the demand and generation, because both are going to massively change. Okay, so where and when we generate our electricity will hugely change. Where and when we use it will hugely change, as well as the volumes that we're talking about. So the first thing is we're definitely going to need a smarter grid. So at the moment, the transmission system and the distribution system are pretty kind of passive systems. Okay, generally speaking, the system just, stuff is done through it and it just takes the power from A to B. And there's very few kind of controllable components. I think that will absolutely change. We will need to hugely improve, sorry, there's someone not on mute, so I think I'm getting a bit of an echo there. We'll need to hugely improve the complexity of how we control the system, far more pushing power around where it needs to go in order to kind of have a lot more power flowing on the existing grid. We're also going to need to modernize the grid and upgrade it. So there are certain bits of the network where, in terms of just the technology, we're using 1960s technology for our conductors and our cables, and that's borne us very well. We put in a really robust system when we did it, but actually there are technologies that we can use today where we can massively increase the capacity of the existing infrastructure just by using modern materials and technologies. So we need a smarter grid, a kind of upgraded grid. But there's absolutely no getting away in kind of any net zero scenario from the need to kind of grow the grid and build new infrastructure, both from the perspective of the kind of locations of where we get and use our energy. So we're getting all this energy now from the North Sea, where before we got it from, the Aire Valley and the coal mining areas. So that just means we need to put infrastructure in places where we haven't had it before. But also on the demand side, at the moment, in the old days, it was all about how much industry did you have. That's where all the electricity was used. It was all around, Sheffield had loads of electricity use, all these steel mills. But actually in the future, suburbia is going to be using a huge amount of electricity compared to what it uses today. So that will potentially mean, big infrastructure upgrades in kind of urban and suburban environments as well. And obviously we've got to do that sensitively and in the best way we can, undergrounding and things like that. So yeah, it's definitely it'll need to be a smarter grid. It will need to be a more modern grid, but it will also need to be a bigger grid.
I think we finally have Laura back. She's got a hand up. So Laura.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll keep my video off.
No worries.
Because I feel like my connection is not ideal, but do let me know if you can't hear me, please. I didn't hear the question completely. I think it was about smart devices and the need to be smarter. And I think I totally agree with what Simon said. The transition to a smart grid. We do need this transition. And this is again coming back to my point that the electricity supply will be more variable, coming from mainly from renewable energy sources, and also the electricity demand will increase. And so this net zero transition requires new flexible technologies on the demand side of the system that were not required before. And this sort of, the flexibility could be provided in several ways, as I said, interconnection, storage, but also DSR. And I think DSR in this can be very powerful because it's a form of flexibility which can be used for many purposes. So, for example, to match electricity demand to the amount of supply available in the market. So, for example, through time of use tariff. So also allowing consumers to reduce their energy bill, but also to allow electricity system operators to adjust the imbalances that are short term between the supply and demand on a second by second basis, to also allow grid balancing without dispatchable fossil fuel generation. It can allow consumers to choose to decrease their carbon footprint. So, for example, running the appliances at a time where there are lowest grid carbon intensities, getting, for example, instantaneous grid carbon intensity data. It can also manage peak loads on electricity distribution and transmission networks, reduce the need for future network upgrades that could be costly, and also to control network characteristics, so frequency, voltage, inertia, supports the system operation, and also provide an emergency response function in the event of a fault in the network, or also prevent blackouts. So these technologies will be essential for the transition and also for providing flexibility. And one of the technologies that I'm thinking about, for example, is the smart electric vehicle charge points. These this is ideal for providing DSR because the consumer has some specific requirements. So, for example, to be able to drive the electric vehicle at a specific time, but is less concerned about precisely when the EV is charged, provided the requirements are met. So the electric vehicles offer new opportunities for consumers to be part of this smart and flexible electricity system. And the consumers can also benefit from cheaper electricity and charge during off-peak periods. But electric vehicles are not the only appliances that can kind of provide DSR. Recently, 2 technical specifications have been published, past 1878 and 1879. They were developed in the UK by the British Standard Institute, with a process which was industry-led and also sponsored by BEIS. And these standards cover a technical framework for providing DSR through 5 key appliances, which is heating, ventilation, air conditioning equipment, EV charge point, of course, cold and wet appliances, but also battery storage. So I think there is, we're transitioning potentially to a world in which we have the future smart home, in which consumer will be, able to also support the grid in moments of need, but at the same time optimizing against other factors such as carbon intensity or time of use tariff. I'll stop there because I feel like I spoke for a long time, but I hope you heard me all right for all of it.
Yep. Aita, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, I think what needs to happen to the grid and the technologies have been very comprehensively covered. Maybe perhaps 3 additional points, I think, which we often find when we're talking about these needs. I'm sure Simon does too, but with policymakers, is first of all recognizing that for the grid to play the role it needs to play, you need to think about the broader system design and firstly about power market design. So you need a system that enables storage providers, a power market design system that enables storage providers to be bidding into markets and to compensate it. Also, some of the auxiliary services that perhaps historically were bundled in fossil generation. We kind of got them for free. We didn't need to think about how do we procure for the system, inertia, frequency control, different parts. But in the power system of the future that we need to build, and also because as Sam said, in the UK we have this incredible wind resource complemented by some solar, and we also have the ability to interconnect with lots of other regions which have hydro and have other, a wider balancing area. And we do need to think about procuring those services so that the grid can be managed effectively. So that was the first thing as kind of an additional thing for the grid needs. The second thing is the investment for the grid. And this is a real challenge in the world of, we have been existing in a world of a kind of flat power system, actually slightly declining indeed power system. We are not policymakers and indeed industry, we're not used to the idea that we need to grow this system. We need to build more. And unfortunately, because of the pressures of the climate crisis, we need to build more rapidly. We need to do it now. So how do we fund the investment? How do we, especially anticipatory investment, where we know there'll be bottlenecks? How do we unlock so that the grid providers can invest in strengthening connections or making new strategic connections that unlock new generation sites, etc. And then the third thing is new capabilities. I think in the UK, we've been able to show how we're actually a leader in how fast and how far you can integrate renewables. And indeed, we coordinate quite a lot of conversations, and I know National Grid does too, talking to other grids of the world where there's less of a belief that it's possible. And actually, the National Grid engineers can stand there and say, no, we do it. It's possible. It's challenging, but here's how you manage it. But we know that the new system that Laura's described with all these new demand-side technologies are much more happening at the distribution level than has happened before. And we'll also probably need new capabilities into, in particular, things like a distribution system network operator to be thinking about how to optimize. So there are also kind of new capabilities that the grid needs to enable us to manage this kind of much this fundamentally new type of grid that we think is we can build, but we need to recognize that it is a bit of a step change from the past.
So from your point there, where is the investment going to come from?
In terms of investment, so I think when we think about the investment needed for the transition, the first thing to recognize is that the bulk of the investment that we need is actually in the power system. We estimate a kind of 3/4 of the total investment needs for the entire kind of global system transition towards a net zero economy is actually in the power system. And that's roughly split between around 55% on generation and around 45% on T&D. On the generation side, here we think that well-designed power markets actually can channel huge amounts of private capital into that generation. And the particular kind of piece that you really need to recognize, especially with wind and solar build out, is the fact that they have very high capex, they have very low opex. So the cost of capital, the financing cost that you are able to get for that initial capex investment is critical to making sure that that's as cheap as possible. And we think that appropriate power market design, for instance, continued use of long-term contracts, of auction structures with no subsidy. We're not looking for competitive auctions, not a subsidy, but that provide long-term certainty over the lifetime of the contract is massive in terms of allowing investors to demand kind of lower returns, to see it as lower risk, especially in a kind of increasing variable renewable system where you have very different price profiles than we've ever had before. So looking back at the history of how could we expect a solar, the profile of revenues from a solar asset of the past isn't really going to help us as we get into these kind of over 50% variable renewable generation world that we're heading towards. So I think on the generation side, there's a really interesting kind of how can we get the huge amounts of private capital that and the investment that is actually looking for returns, how can we channel that to the power system very quickly? On the distribution side, it is a little bit more challenging. They obviously are regulated assets, but here we have to think about what are the benefits of this system build out, and how are they being spread in terms of who will get those benefits and where are the costs? So today's system is really limited in terms of what network operators can do. They pretty much have to wait, and Simon can talk about this probably, and maybe I'll hand over to Simon to talk more about this, but they pretty much have to wait until the system is about to fall over before you can make a case, and that is then very much passed on to current consumers. If we know we're doing a historic strengthening the next generation of our grid that's going to enable net zero for a much longer period and for consumers of the future, we really do need to look at how we're regulating those assets, how we avoid bottlenecks, we allow, we don't basically fail because we just couldn't build the system fast enough, and that we're fair in terms of spreading that over the lifetime of the benefit that investment will be felt.
Yeah, so I'm happy to jump in on this particular challenge around regulating and funding on the network side. So I think it's very true. I mean, there's slightly different regulatory systems depending on kind of what voltage level you're at and kind of why you're trying to build something. But we do have a massive problem that I think is only just being acknowledged, that when we think about the benefits and costs of building network, we tend to think of the cost of building the thing and the kind of costs of, well, if we don't build the thing, there'll be some more system balancing costs or something, say, some sort of OPEX costs. But what we don't think about is the loss of what you can't do because you haven't built the network, right? We don't think of the fact that we don't have a wind farm now that we could have built, that we could have done. We don't think about the decarbonisation of demand that we could have done, that we've had to say no to, and that whoever wanted to build that are having to wait or have had to bin off the project. And that it's kind of that risk, that cost, that because we've been in this kind of steady state, slight decline world, we've not really thought about. And so I think we do need to make sure that we're removing blockers where a network would love to build a reinforcement, but their regulation says so-and-so has to pay and so-and-so can't pay, but they wouldn't be the only beneficiary. So that's kind of quite an unfair system. But then also that kind of active unlocking of like, where do we need to make really long-term sensible decisions about something where we need to do something, but actually maybe we need to do something even bigger because we just know in 20 years' time we're going to need even more. And we don't have time to keep coming back to the parts of the network that we've already upgraded. And we have to go and do it again every 10, 12, 15, 20 years because we didn't do a proper job the first time. And that there's an anticipatory regulatory funding kind of question about that. Because to be honest, I've been reflecting on this and it's really hard for me to think of sensible investments we can make in the network that we're going to regret. Like we're just going to need more capacity absolutely everywhere. I mean, 99% of places on the network. So it's actually really hard to make a bad investment at this point. And I think we need to recognize that we're in that world, not the world that we've been in for the last 30, 40 years. So, and I think as well as regulatory funding, this is a place where planning needs to also be we need to make good long-term decisions about planning. And we need to recognize that this is infrastructure for all of us that's going to transform our society for the better. And it's really important for the whole planet. So we need an infrastructure kind of planning mindset that's aligned with that as well.
And I'm aware we only have 3 minutes left, but we've been talking about like investment from like a network side and from a commercial side in terms of generation. But there's also obviously got to be consumer buy-in in order to sort of reach net zero. And at the moment, with energy bills rising and the cost of living crisis, how do you persuade consumers to invest in like a heat pump or an electric vehicle during these times?
I think the key thing here is to recognize that there's the transition has lots of different costs and they fall differently on different people. There's lots of areas where decarbonisation of products will have very limited effects on consumers. So, for instance, if you think about the additional cost of decarbonising your steel production and you run that through to your house that you're building, you're into kind of less than 1% in building a new building for someone to live in terms of the total cost. So one is to remember that. There's also then those points of where are there areas where there should be benefits for the consumer? And I think the EV example is a really good one. So first of all, driving your EV on renewables should be cheaper than the equivalent of fuel. Now, at the moment, we don't have our power market design right to ensure that consumers are seeing the benefits of lower cost generation. Consumers don't have that signal because they're actually the opposite. They've seen prices follow the really high cost, marginal cost of the flexible generation from gas. Also, we're talking about a technology that in general should be better for the consumer. An electric car is simpler, it's easier to run, the kind of technology is better. So I think it's not so much a kind of let's look at one area that we need to do and say, well, that looks really hard. That means it's going to be really difficult to convince people to do everything. It's more about going through and saying, well, where are their benefits and making sure those are clear, or that we have the power system, the kind of policy and regulatory framework so that they are actually visible to the consumer. And then where there are challenges like heat pumps, those are the really tricky, for the UK, probably the most tricky problem we face to decarbonise the UK is residential heating. And I think that's probably the one that is most still open to debate and is most difficult to see how we're going to fund it, how we're going to get all these different individual actors to act in the time we need. And we shouldn't shy away from that, but it doesn't mean that all parts of the transition are going to be really costly.
I realised I'm on mute. Laura, I'll hand it over to you, sorry.
Thank you, Jordan. I think I'm at the very last minute. So I completely agree with what has been said by now. And I think it's really important to make the consumer feel empowered and also to protect the consumer whenever we're thinking about our strategy. And also, for example, specifically thinking in terms of DSR, which, as I said, will be a big piece of the future. It's important to reward the consumer for providing benefits to the grid, for example, and for providing the DSR, and making sure these benefits, as has been said just now, are clearly explained, and the consumer is aware of the contribution that they're making to the transition, as well as are aware of the benefit that they can get themselves when contributing. And yes, thank you. I'll stop here because I realize we are over time.
We are technically over the time. I just really want to quickly, we do have an audience question, which is from Linda. She says, with investment capacity, need for societal awareness and speed of change amongst the key points being made, what role does community energy have or could have in achieving net zero? Anyone want to take that? Nope.
I'm happy to.
Simon, do you want to go? And I'll chip in.
Yeah. So I think there's some areas where local coordination is going to be really important. I think one area around heat networks could become a real key in certain areas. It makes sense that could be a really important area where having a local energy a local energy kind of plan and getting together on that level is going to make potential real help and support there. And I think there's also questions around can people who want to kind of invest themselves in this transition and get involved and willing to sort of reap these benefits as well. I think at the moment that's something that groups are starting to do. I think it's important to realize that kind of with everything in net zero, you need a bit of everything. Like everything can't be kind of community driven. Everything can't be, massive kind of huge centralized project driven. I think it's a case of every bit of this helps.
The other area I would highlight in particular, where I think looking at community asset ownership models can be really powerful. One of the challenges that we really do have, we obviously have it for the transmission distribution network, but we crucially also have it for generation, is planning and permitting for wind and solar. That will be the core power that's, powering our economy of the future. We hopefully can get to a point where we see them and they're very uplifting, and we can but at the moment they are, there's a lot of pushback. In Sweden, I think it's something like 70 to 80% of new wind applications have been, are rejected on the first stage due to, community pushback. Given that we need to be building this, given this is going to power our society, what are the different ways of thinking really strategically and at a country level about what we need to build and where are the right places to build it? And one of the things that can really make, can really transform a community's perspective of a wind or solar development is directly feeling the benefits for their community. And we know that, across the UK, we have the levelling up agenda. We know we have regional disparities, making sure that communities are directly benefiting and there's different models. There's a bunch of ones that, could go into talking about the different ways you can do this, but can be really crucial for having local communities welcome some of the new technologies of the future, alongside perhaps more, local community energy projects as well. But I do think that, shared or at least benefits flowing from assets can be really, really helpful at unlocking the speed we need to go at.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. Laura, Ita, and Simon, thank you for your contribution to this panel. I realize we're 5 minutes over, and I hope I didn't take up too much of your time. But it has been a very insightful
Thank you very much.
Discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Have a great day.